Hi, this is the fellow passenger. Let's take a look at some of the quirks and hacks on the Behringer 2600 that are not mentioned in the manual. In this video, we will be going through triggering the envelopes using an external gate and trigger, triggering the sample and hold from an external clock source, triggering the elec switch from an external clock source, syncing the internal clock to an external clock source, syncing the LFO to an external clock source, and an LFO versus sample and hold chaos hack that I found. You can find links to each of the sections if you look at the description below, if you just want to jump ahead to the section that you're interested in. But before we start, some of the above I discovered just by chance, and some of it I found around the internet, but I thought it would be a good thing to take those things and just collate in one video of my findings. Also, most of the above come with some sort of caveat, as you will see. I got the Blue Marvin edition here, but the same should apply to any of the other Behringer models. I cannot vouch for the original ARP 2600, the Korg reissue, or the TTS Age, or any other 2600 clone. If you stick around till the end, I will give you a little bit of philosophy of why I'm featuring a hardware synth all of a sudden on this channel where I mainly do Ableton stuff. I also got a few things to share with my Patreons in relation to this philosophy and this video in particular. But okay, let's get started. Let's take a look at this envelope module here, which you should be able to trigger by using a gate input or a trigger input. Make sure that this switch is in its up position, because otherwise it will be triggered by the clock here. So when it's in this position, I would expect to be able to plug a gate into the gate input, for example, and then press a key on my keyboard. I got a Behringer swing just off camera, but when I press a key, nothing is happening. And just to demonstrate, if I plug that into the trigger input and do the same, nothing is happening either. So I thought my unit was faulty, but it seemed like other people were having the same problem online. So I have contacted Behringer, and they also confirmed that you should be able to trigger them manually or like independently from one another. I just needed to make sure that, let's see what they actually said. They said that one of them needed at least 5 volts and the other one needed 4 volts. I can't remember which one was which now, but it should work independently. Mine clearly doesn't, and other people's didn't do either. But I also found a hack around this. So if you take the gate output of something and you plug it into the mult section here, and then we multiply the signal, one goes into the gate and the other one goes in to the trigger. Now when I press a key, all of a sudden it's working. So it needs a signal in both inputs to work, which is strange. So still, I don't know if my unit is part of a faulty batch or if this generally is the case. You can let me know in the comments below. But if you're having this problem and you can't trigger it, you can always do it in a way similar to this, where you use a mult or something, or maybe having two completely different sources. I've also tried to, just to make sure that it's not the signal that is too weak, I have plugged my signal into the preamp module and boosted it. That didn't make a difference. I've also tried trigger outputs from my BeatStep Pro, and that didn't work either. All right, let's take a look at the sample and hold module. The manual states that you should be able to send an external clock in to override the internal clock, and that your external clock will start triggering the sample and hold circuit. Some friends of mine said, oh, mine doesn't seem to work. And I would say fair and then, because I would expect if I plug an external clock in, let's say we take the square LFO out and I plug that to the clock input, and if I change the LFO speed, you can see the rate here is not changing. So to me, it looks like the internal clock isn't overridden, but it actually is in terms of triggering the sample and hold. And just to demonstrate this, we are just going to open the filter. I'll open the VCA, so we've got a tone. And as you see, now when I change the speed on the LFO, it's indeed triggering the sample and hold circuit and creating that sample and hold effect on the filter. So that is working. It would be quite useful to be able to properly override the internal clock, wouldn't it? Especially because this electronic switch unit here, which can be quite useful and a creative tool, but it didn't seem possible to trigger this other than by the internal clock here. You can see them switching. That was another question I had to Behringer, and this is what they said in response. The electronic switch back and forth switching will only work on the internal clock, unlike sample and hold, which uses the internal clock or an external clock. I found that extremely limiting. But it turns out that what they are saying is not entirely true. You can sort of trigger this from an external clock. So let's have a look how we do that. I'm going to pull that switch down and turn oscillator 1 into LFO mode. I'm going to explain a little bit later in this video why I'm doing that rather than using the LFO, but if you hang in there, you will hear why. So now, I should probably take a slightly longer cable. That one is not long enough. Keep an eye on these little switches, or the elec switch here, the LEDs. I plugged the external clock in. They still go as slow as the internal clock there, still responding to that. But if we don't plug this cable in fully, this may need a little bit of a wiggle, but keep an eye on those LEDs now. I'm going to speed up this LFO a bit here. Can you see? So when I'm pitching it down, they slow down, and when I pitch it up, they speed up. So you can actually trigger these externally. You can also do this I tried from the Behringer switch, and you take the gate output and plug in there, and every time you press a key, the switch jumps. Looks great, right? There is just one little quirk, because even though the clock is all the way down, it's actually not entirely off. So you can see it's still blinking, even though it's really, really slow. Unfortunately, this triggers the elec switch as well as the clock that you are sending in. So every so often, you will probably get a switch that you didn't trigger and might not be in sync with whatever you're trying to do. But at least something. What you can do, let's plug this in again, just to create, you can also create a little bit of chaos if you want to. If we take that LFO out from oscillator 1 and we don't push the cable in all the way, and we are going to get that trick. Oh, it's just a little bit fiddly, so you have to just get it in the right position, because it's triggered both by that LFO and the internal clock. So if we turn this up a bit, we're going to get some very sporadic, we turn that LFO down a bit, so they are sort of running out of sync with each other. You just get some very chaotic results. So if you want to create some random switching, that could be a technique to do that. There is actually a way to sort of override the internal clock. Just look at this. If we turn that all the way down. We take the LFO again from oscillator 1, the square wave, and then let's wait till that is turned off, and we plug it into the internal clock output. Did you see there? Now it's on again, but once the internal clock turns off, this is now synced to the LFO here. And so is the electronic switch. The weird thing is, though, as I mentioned, the internal clock is not off. This only works when it's in its off state, and when it goes on, it stays on permanently again. So it's sort of an alternative way of clocking it. Again, not completely satisfactory. But yeah, an alternative to this is the only way I've found to actually affect this internal signal here. So it seems like the clock output kind of works in reverse. The LFO section, you can do a similar hack to the sample and hold, that we can sync this to an external clock source with a similar result, because it turns out that the LFO square wave works in two directions. So if we take the pulse out of the first oscillator, which is set to LFO mode, and we plug it in, we turn that down. Now we're going to see, while this LED is off, it's going to sync to this LFO if we plug it in here. So you see I can change the LFO speed here. But just like with the sample and hold, the internal LFO is actually not turned off. So it will only sync while the internal LFO is in its off state. But that's a weird quirk. So yeah, let's move on to the next hack and tip that I found. Now we have found that this square wave works in two directions, and also the internal clock out works in two directions. We can create some LFO sample and hold chaos, so we can create an erratic channel. This is also why, when I was demoing that earlier, that I wanted to use oscillator 1 as the LFO, because otherwise we would have jumped the gun and I would have reached this chaos state a lot earlier. So this means that this one is both receiving and sending LFO. And this one is both sending and receiving LFO. So they are going to both affect one another to create very chaotic, unpredictable patterns, as you can see on the blinking here. So that could be an interesting way of creating some random effects. I hope you found these quirks and hacks helpful, and it helps you enjoy this machine. Now we're going to get into the philosophy section. I do a lot of Ableton, and most of you is probably more familiar with my Ableton focused videos. There are some hardware videos in there. I got a whole bunch of hardware that I've been collecting since about 1996, I think. And I think I probably got slightly too much, and I'm going to get rid of some. But also, a lot of the hardware that I have, I don't think I have given it the time it deserves, because each instrument, if you're just forced to work with it, you can squeeze a lot of interesting things out of it. Like these hacks that I've found with the 2600 here. I don't think I would have found those unless I would have just spent some dedicated time with this one instrument over a period of time. So this is the first one that I decided to just sit down and it's like, okay, I'm going to unplug the rest of the stuff and just use this one. And also because it's so cold in my studio, which is out in the garden, it's just good to take an instrument into the house and not being overwhelmed by everything else that is in there. And you just literally just really get under the skin of how that instrument works. And I've really enjoyed that process, and I've learned a lot about this instrument alone. And by just working with it, it's made me really creative in terms of just sound design, how it works, how can I try to push its limits. And here is where the Patreon thing comes in, because I decided to spend some time making some tracks just using this unit, obviously doing a lot of multi-tracking, generating sounds, and just pushing myself to learn doing proper sound design with this. So I've created a few hundred samples. I decided to focus on creating percussive sounds. So I've created kicks and snares and hi-hats and all sorts of things using just this unit. So I've started building my 2024 sound library. And if you sign up to my Patreon, I would love to share them with you. You're going to hear in the background here, I'm just going to play some of those sounds for you. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that I hopefully will keep you going for quite a while. You will get a few hundred samples. I hope you really enjoyed watching this. And if you can sponsor me on Patreon to keep me going, that would be very much appreciated. If you enjoy this, please let me know, because I am planning to, regardless if I make videos or not, I'm going to keep going through my instruments and really get under the skin, and then be very ruthless and choose the pieces of equipment that makes a big difference to me. And some things will probably need to go. Also, the Behringer 2600, I appreciate that that could be a somewhat overwhelming instrument for some, if that is something that you pick up in your early explorations of sound. It's extremely powerful, but it is not quite as overwhelming as it looks. But if you feel like you could do with a getting started video on the 2600, I would be more than happy to do one. So please give me a shout. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.